I was kneeling on cold stone at the Blue Ridge overlook, pressing my wife's scarf against the blood pooling beneath her skull, when I called my son. His voice carried no fear, no worry, just the clinking of champagne glasses and a woman's laughter somewhere behind him. "She's not my problem, Dad. I have collectors in from Miami. Handle it." So I handled it. But not the way he expected. Before I tell you what I found the next morning, the document I signed, and the 38 calls I refused to answer, take a moment to tell me where you are watching from and what the weather looks like outside your window right now. And please, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss a single chapter of this journey. A quick note before we go deeper. This story contains dramatized elements crafted to strengthen the emotional impact of the narrative. 40 years. That is how long I had spent hunched over other people's broken timepieces, coaxing frozen gears back into motion, replacing cracked mainsprings with steady hands, and the kind of patience that only comes from understanding that time, once lost, never truly returns. My name is Raymond Oakes. I am 67 years old, a retired horologist living in Asheville, North Carolina, and on the evening of October 11th, at approximately 6:23 in the evening, every mechanism inside my carefully ordered life seized at once. It was supposed to be a perfect night. Our 40th wedding anniversary. Eleanor had chosen the restaurant herself, a quiet place called the Laurel Ridge Inn tucked along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where the mountains fold into each other like the pages of a very old book. The dinner was simple but warm. Roasted trout, sparkling cider, and a small silver brooch I had found at an estate sale, shaped like a sprig of mountain laurel. When I pinned it to her collar, her eyes caught the candlelight, and for a moment, she looked exactly as she had the night I proposed in a cramped apartment in Hendersonville 40 years ago. 40 years, Raymond, she said softly, touching the brooch. That is a long time to keep anything running. In my vest pocket, the silver pocket watch that had belonged to her father ticked steadily against my ribs. I carried it everywhere. Not because it kept perfect time. It actually ran 2 minutes slow. But because it kept something more important. It kept memory. After dinner, she suggested we walk to the overlook. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the smoky sweetness of fallen leaves. The sun had already dropped behind the ridgeline, leaving the sky bruised in amber and violet. Eleanor took my arm, her grip firm, her breathing heavier than usual from the altitude. I should have paid attention to that breathing. For 40 years I had trained my hands to detect the faintest irregularity inside a clockwork mechanism. The whisper of a worn bearing, the subtle drag of a misaligned wheel. And yet I failed to notice the most important signal of all, the quiet strain in my wife's lungs as we climbed the last 50 yards of gravel toward the stone railing. She stopped at the edge. The Blue Ridge stretched below us like a dark ocean frozen in mid-wave. Her hand tightened on my arm. "Raymond," she whispered, and her voice carried a strange thinness, as if the word had been stretched too far. Then she crumbled. Not slowly, not gracefully. She folded inward like a mechanism whose mainspring had suddenly snapped, her knees buckling, her weight pulling sideways. And then the sound I will carry for whatever years I have left, the dull, wet crack of her skull meeting stone. I caught her too late. Blood appeared beneath her hair, dark and immediate, spreading across the pale rock with the terrible patience of oil, seeping through a cracked watch case. I pressed her scarf against the wound, my fingers shaking in a way they had never shaken in 4 decades of handling irreplaceable antiques. "Ellie, stay with me." I dialed 911 first. Then I called my son. Gavin answered on the 4th ring. Behind his voice I heard conversation, clinking glasses, a woman laughing bright and careless. The sounds of a party. The sounds of a man with no interest that his mother was bleeding on a mountaintop. "Gavin, listen. Your mother collapsed at the Blue Ridge overlook. There is blood. I need you at Mission Hospital now." A pause. Not shock. Inconvenience. I recognized it because I have spent a lifetime listening for the silences between ticking seconds, and this one was hollow. She's not my problem, Dad. I have collectors in from Miami. Handle it. The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen while October wind pulled at my coat and a siren began climbing the mountain road below. The pocket watch ticked steadily against my chest, 2 minutes slow, measuring moments that might be the last ones Eleanor and I would ever share. I said one word into the empty air. Fine. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They moved with a precision I understood instinctively, every motion calculated to preserve the fragile machinery of a human life. I rode in the ambulance holding Eleanor's hand, watching the oxygen mask fog and clear with each shallow breath. At Mission Hospital, they wheeled her through heavy double doors that sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss. A nurse whose badge read Carmen touched my shoulder. Mr. Oakes, the neurosurgery team is prepping now. Subdural hematoma. They are moving fast, which is a good sign. I sat. The waiting room smelled of floor polish and recycled air. I pulled the pocket watch from my vest and held it in my open palm. Eleanor's father had given it to me the week before our wedding. Take care of time, he had said. And time will take care of everything else. 40 years I had believed him. I had fixed clocks for museums, for collectors, for old women who wept when they heard their grandmother's mantel clock chime again after decades of silence. Precision was my gift. Patience was my method. And somehow, in all those years of careful attention, I had never once turned that same scrutiny toward the mechanisms ticking inside my own home. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I counted everyone on the pocket watch. When the surgeon emerged, his face carried the exhaustion of a man who had just fought gravity and barely won. Your wife survived. She is in a medically induced coma. Stable, but the next 48 hours are critical. Stable. The word hung in the air like a pendulum that had not yet decided which direction to swing. I thanked him and sank into the hard plastic chair. I checked my phone for messages from Gavin. Nothing. No calls, no texts, no sign that the man who shared my last name had spent a single second wondering whether his mother would see the morning. Have you ever sat in a room surrounded by machines, keeping someone alive and realized that the silence from your own family is louder than all of them combined? That kind of quiet does not feel empty. It hums, low and relentless, like a mechanism winding towards something you cannot yet see. I was about to close my eyes when Nurse Carmen returned with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. Mr. Oakes, I am sorry to ask this now, but we need to process the insurance authorization for the neurosurgery. Could I see your wife's insurance card? I found the card in Eleanor's handbag and handed it over. Carmen disappeared behind the station. When she came back, her expression had changed into something careful and heavy. Mr. Oakes, she said slowly, this policy was terminated 3 months ago. There is no active coverage for your wife. 3 months. The words landed on me like a gear slipping loose inside a precision mechanism. That sudden sideways lurch, when you realize something has been wrong for far longer than the moment you noticed it. I stared at Nurse Carmen, my mouth working around a question that my brain had not yet finished assembling. That is impossible, I said. I have been paying that premium for 11 years. There has never been a lapse. Carmen's eyes carried the careful sympathy of someone who had delivered too many versions of this conversation. I can only tell you what the system shows, Mr. Oakes. The policy was terminated in July. If there has been an error, you would need to contact the provider directly. In the meantime, we still need to process payment for the neurosurgery. How much? $12,000 for the emergency procedure. Additional costs will depend on the length of her ICU stay. I reached for my wallet. My primary credit card, the one Eleanor and I had maintained for 23 years with a $60,000 limit, slid into the payment terminal. The small screen blinked once, then displayed a single word that would begin to unravel everything. Declined. I pulled the card out and tried again, pressing it more firmly into the reader as though the problem were mechanical, as though pressure could fix what was already broken. Declined. I reached for the backup card, the one linked to our home equity account, the safety net I had never once needed to use. Declined. There is more than enough on both of those lines, I said. And I could hear the tremor in my own voice, the hairline fracture spreading through a structure that had not yet realized it was falling. Carmen offered to give me a few minutes and stepped away quietly. I stood alone in the fluorescent corridor at 2:17 in the morning, holding two useless pieces of plastic, while somewhere behind the sealed ICU doors my wife's brain was swelling against the walls of her own skull. The pocket watch ticked in my vest, steady and indifferent. The only mechanism in my life still functioning as designed. I pulled out my phone. The banking application loaded slowly, its progress circle spinning in the blue-white glow like the balance wheel of a clock running down. When the numbers finally appeared, the corridor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Our retirement account, the $380,000 that Eleanor and I had built across 4 decades of careful living, showed a balance of $4,200. I refreshed the screen. The number did not change. I navigated to the investment accounts. Empty. The checking account held barely $3,000. I pressed my thumb against the transaction history tab, and the screen filled with a scrolling list of wire transfers that stretched back 14 months. 14 months. While I had been sitting in my workshop restoring antique timepieces, someone had been methodically dismantling the financial architecture of my entire life. Transfer after transfer, each one routed to the same recipient, each one authorized through credentials I had never shared. The recipient name appeared on every line, repeated with the cold regularity of a metronome. Oaks Contemporary LLC. My son's gallery. I lowered the phone slowly. The fluorescent tube above me buzzed with a faint electrical whine that sounded like the high-pitched warning a mainspring gives just before it snaps. I had spent 40 years diagnosing failure in complex mechanisms. I could identify the precise moment a gear tooth began to wear, the exact degree of tension that would cause a hairspring to deform. But I had never applied that diagnostic instinct to my own family, and the failure I was now staring at was catastrophic. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that the idea of checking behind them never once crossed your mind? That is not love. That is a blind spot. So mean. End of chapter 12. And blind spots, in my profession, are where bridges collapse and clock towers fall silent. I forced my hands to stop trembling and dialed the bank's emergency fraud line. The hold music played for 9 minutes, a cheerful instrumental loop that felt like a cruel joke inside a hospital corridor at 2:30 in the morning. When a voice finally answered, it belonged to a woman who identified herself as a senior fraud investigator. "Mr. Oaks," she said carefully after pulling up my records. "Our system flagged a series of wire transfers linked to your accounts over the past 14 months. These transactions were authorized through a durable power of attorney submitted last August." "Last August," I whispered. "I have not been to that bank with my son in years." There was a pause before she continued. "The records also show that the primary email address associated with your account was changed approximately 14 months ago." She read the address. roaksrecords@gmail.com. I had never seen it in my life. The silence suddenly made terrible sense. No alerts, no transaction notifications, no monthly statements arriving in my mailbox. The entire digital trail had been quietly rerouted, while hundreds of thousands of dollars were siphoned away, transfer by transfer, month by month, like water draining through a hairline crack in a foundation wall. You do not hear the water. You only notice it when the floor gives way. "He did not just take the money," I said, more to myself than to the woman on the phone. "He took my name." She offered to email copies of the authorization documents and flagged the account for a formal investigation. I thanked her and ended the call. My legs felt hollow, as though someone had removed the load-bearing structure from inside my own bones. I walked back to the ICU doors and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Beyond the partition, machines blinked and hissed, keeping Eleanor's body alive while the life we had built around it was being quietly stripped for parts. I whispered through the glass. "I am going to fix this, Ellie. I just need to find out how deep the damage goes." My phone buzzed in my hand. Not a call. A notification from the home security application that Eleanor had insisted we install 2 years ago, after a break-in on our street. It monitored our property and sent alerts whenever a registered vehicle entered the driveway. The notification was stamped 2:51 in the morning. The message was brief. Vehicle detected. Black Range Rover. Workshop driveway. Gavin's Range Rover. The one he had purchased 8 months ago, with money I was now certain had never been his. My son was at my workshop at 3 in the morning, while his mother lay in a coma and his father stood in a hospital corridor, discovering that his entire life savings had been hollowed out from the inside. He was not visiting. He was not checking on the house. He was removing something. And whatever it was, he did not want me to see it. I did not sleep. I sat in the hard plastic chair outside the ICU, watching the pale green numbers on the hallway clock tick forward, while my mind replayed the security footage notification on a continuous loop. Black Range Rover. Workshop driveway. 2:51 in the morning. By the time the first thin light of dawn crept across the hospital linoleum, I had already called the bank's fraud department twice more, spoken to a patient financial counselor about emergency payment arrangements, and compiled a mental inventory of every asset. Eleanor and I had accumulated across 4 decades of careful, quiet living. The inventory was devastating. The retirement fund was gutted. The credit lines were maxed or frozen. Our home insurance premiums, which Gavin had offered to manage through his company's group plan last year, had apparently been redirected into a void. The only piece of good news came from Nurse Carmen, who informed me that the hospital's charity care program could temporarily cover Eleanor's ICU costs while I sorted out what she politely called the billing complications. Billing complications. As though my son had simply misfiled some paperwork, instead of systematically dismantling the financial foundation of 2 lives. At 8:22 that morning, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as a senior fraud investigator from the bank's headquarters, a different woman from the one I had spoken to overnight. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to dissecting financial crimes the way a surgeon dissects tissue, with precision and zero sentiment. "Mr. Oakes, I have reviewed the documentation associated with your accounts. The durable power of attorney was submitted in person at our downtown branch last August. The individual who submitted it presented valid identification and was accompanied by a notary public." She paused. "The notary's name on file is Daniel Fisk. I did not recognize the name, but I wrote it down on the back of a hospital receipt, with the careful deliberation of a man recording serial numbers inside a watch case. Every detail mattered now." She continued. "Over the past 14 months, approximately $375,000 was transferred in 63 separate transactions to an LLC registered under the name Oakes Contemporary. The transfers were structured to remain below automated fraud detection thresholds. 63 transactions. He had not stolen my life in one violent act. He had picked it apart gear by gear, month by month, with the patience of someone who understood that small, regular withdrawals attract far less attention than a single catastrophic theft. It was methodical. It was architectural. And it was my son. I was still processing this when the elevator at the end of the corridor chimed. The doors parted, and Gavin Oakes stepped onto the ICU floor. He looked immaculate. A charcoal cashmere overcoat draped across his shoulders like a theater curtain. Italian leather shoes that clicked against the hospital floor with a rhythm that reminded me of the sharp, deliberate tapping of a clockmaker's hammer. In one hand, he carried a designer coffee cup, the scent of expensive espresso cutting through the sterile corridor air like cologne at a funeral. In the other hand, a slim leather briefcase. He did not rush toward the ICU. He paused near the glass partition by the nurse's station, adjusted the collar of his coat, and checked his reflection with the unhurried ease of a man arriving at a gallery opening rather than his mother's deathbed. When he finally approached me, he offered a brief, practiced hug. It lasted exactly 2 seconds. The kind of embrace designed to satisfy the minimum requirement of human contact without actually transferring any warmth. "God, this place is grim," he said, glancing around the corridor. "The lighting alone could trigger a depressive episode. Have they considered bringing in a design consultant? Your mother is in a coma, Gavin." He took a sip of his coffee. "You mentioned that last night. How is she?" "She has bleeding in her brain. They drilled through her skull to drain it. She might not wake up." He nodded the way someone nods when a waiter describes the daily specials, polite and already thinking about something else. He did not move toward the ICU doors. He did not ask to see her. He stood in the hallway, 6 feet from the room where Eleanor lay, connected to machines that were doing the work her own body could no longer manage. And he did not take a single step closer. I lowered my voice. "I checked the bank accounts this morning, Gavin. I saw the transfers. $375,000. All of it routed to Oak's Contemporary." Something shifted behind his eyes, a quick mechanical adjustment, like a watch escapement clicking into a new position. But his expression did not change. "That is a gross oversimplification," he said, his tone carrying the smooth, rehearsed quality of a man who had anticipated this conversation. "Those were strategic capital movements. Liquidity cycling through investment vehicles. You do not understand modern financial architecture, Dad. The money is working. It is generating returns that will benefit all of us in the long run. Your mother needed surgery last night. I could not pay for it. That sounds like a cash flow timing issue, not a structural problem. Have you ever looked into the face of someone you raised from an infant and realized you are speaking to a stranger? Not a stranger in the ordinary sense, but something more unsettling. A stranger who has memorized every detail of your life and is using that knowledge to dismantle you from the inside. I need that money returned, Gavin. Immediately. He glanced at the gold watch on his wrist, a piece I recognized instantly. It was a 1968 Omega Seamaster that had belonged to my private collection. I had last seen it inside the display case in my workshop. "I have a collector dinner tonight, at the Grove Park Inn," he said, straightening his coat. "We can discuss financial logistics later this week. Call me if anything permanent happens." Permanent. The word landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water. He meant death. He was telling me not to bother him unless Eleanor died. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his Italian shoes clicking their precise rhythm against the floor. As he shifted the briefcase from one hand to the other, the leather flap opened slightly, and the contents tilted into view for just a moment. A blue folder. Inside it, I caught the unmistakable formatting of a real estate appraisal document. The header bore the logo of a commercial property firm I did not recognize, and beneath it, printed in clean black type, was an address I knew better than my own heartbeat. 14 Ridgecrest Lane. Our family cabin. The property that had been in Eleanor's family for 3 generations. The home where I had proposed to her, where Gavin had taken his first steps, where every Thanksgiving for 40 years had begun with the smell of pine smoke and ended with Eleanor reading aloud by the fireplace. He was having it appraised. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft chime, and I stood in the corridor, the pocket watch ticking against my ribs, feeling for the first time in my life the unmistakable vibration of a structure being quietly taken apart from the inside by someone who knew exactly where every bolt was placed. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in months. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. Sharp and direct, carrying the no-nonsense clarity of a woman who had spent 30 years following money through the darkest corners of other people's lives. "Opal, it is Raymond. I need your forensic eyes. My son is dismantling my life, and I just saw the blueprints in his briefcase." Opal Whitfield did not arrive at Mission Hospital carrying flowers or a sympathy card. She walked into the cafeteria 40 minutes after my call, holding a battered leather laptop bag in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other, her reading glasses pushed up into a crown of silver hair that had not been styled for anyone's approval. She wore a quilted vest over a flannel shirt, and her boots left faint traces of garden soil on the hospital linoleum as she crossed the room toward my table. She set the envelope down between us without ceremony. $18,000, she said. Cash. My emergency fund from the floor, safe at the bookshop. Do not argue with me about it, Raymond. Pay the hospital what they need so nobody moves Eleanor an inch. Then we get to work. I opened my mouth to protest. She raised one hand. I did not drive 45 minutes at dawn to have a polite disagreement about pride. Your wife is on a ventilator, and your son has his hand in your pockets. We can discuss the ethics of borrowing later. Right now, we hunt. That was Opal. 69 years old, owner of a cramped second-hand bookshop on Lexington Avenue in downtown Asheville, a woman who shelved first editions beside potboilers and treated every customer with the same blunt honesty, regardless of whether they were buying a $5 paperback or a $500 signed Hemingway. But the bookshop was her second career. Before she spent her days cataloging spines and recommending novels to strangers, Opal Whitfield had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant for the North Carolina Department of Revenue, tracing stolen money through shell companies, offshore ledgers, and the kind of carefully layered financial deception that most people believe only exists in courtroom dramas. She had retired early, not because she lost the passion, but because the work eventually brought the enemy home. Her own son had embezzled from her personal accounts during her final year at the department, a betrayal she rarely discussed and never dramatized. She lost her house. She rebuilt her life inside a 1,200-square-foot bookshop that smelled of old paper and quiet resilience. When she told me about it that morning in the cafeteria, she did not linger on the details. I rebuilt from the ash, Raymond, she said, her eyes steady behind those reading glasses. So will you. But first, you need to see exactly how much he has taken. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford until the bleeding stops. Do you have that one person in your life who does not tell you everything will be fine? The one who hands you the flashlight instead and says, "Start looking." That was Opal. She opened her laptop on the cafeteria table, the screen reflecting blue light across the surface of her untouched coffee. While she pulled up public records databases, she began telling me what she had already observed over the past several months, details she had filed away with the quiet discipline of a woman trained to notice discrepancies. 3 weeks ago, she said, scrolling through a property records portal, I saw Gavin's Range Rover parked in your driveway at 11:30 at night. You and Eleanor were at the church potluck. He was carrying a large cardboard box out of your workshop. I thought it was odd, but Eleanor always defended him, so I kept it to myself. She looked up at me. I should not have kept it to myself. 2 weeks ago, she continued, I stopped by to return a book Eleanor had lent me. She mentioned that Gavin had offered to manage her medical appointments through some digital health platform connected to his company. She said he had already rescheduled several of her visits. I asked which ones. She could not remember. That bothered me. Opal pulled up Eleanor's patient portal, which I had never thought to check. The screen showed a pattern that made my stomach tighten. Eleanor's quarterly cardiology appointment, the one she had maintained for 6 years to monitor her chronic hypertension, had been canceled in June. Her follow-up blood pressure screening in August, canceled. Her medication review in September, canceled. All 3 cancellations had been initiated through the same digital health account, registered under an email address linked to Oaks Contemporary LLC. He did not just steal your money, Raymond, Opal said quietly. He dismantled her safety net, a woman with chronic high blood pressure, and he canceled every appointment designed to keep it under control. The cafeteria hummed around us, the ordinary sounds of trays and conversation feeling absurdly distant, as though Opal and I were sitting inside a sealed chamber while the rest of the world continued turning. She reached across the table and gripped my forearm with a strength that surprised me. I know that look, she said. That is the look of a man trying to decide whether to grieve or fight. Let me make it simple. Grieve. Later. Fight now. Your son is not sloppy, Raymond. He is structured. He planned this the way someone builds a clock. One gear at a time. Which means we take it apart. The same way. She outlined a plan. Tonight, I would go home and inspect the workshop. Whatever Gavin had been carrying out in that cardboard box, whatever he had been accessing at 2:51 in the morning, the evidence would still be there in the gaps, in the things that were missing rather than the things that remained. A forensic accountant does not look for what is present, she told me. She looks for what should be there, and is not. Meanwhile, Opal would run Gavin's company through every public database she could access: corporate filings, tax liens, court records, property transfers. If he has been moving this much cash, she said, there will be a trail. Money always leaves fingerprints. Even stolen money. She turned her laptop toward me. On the screen was a filing from the North Carolina Secretary of State's office, dated 3 weeks earlier. I read it twice before the words fully registered. Oaks Contemporary LLC. Voluntary petition for relief under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code. His gallery was bankrupt. The business my son had built with champagne openings and collector dinners and Italian shoes was drowning in debt. He had not stolen my retirement to fund an empire. He had stolen it to plug holes in a sinking ship. He is desperate, Opal said, closing the laptop with a quiet click. And desperate people do not stop stealing. They accelerate. Whatever he has planned next, Raymond, it is already in motion. I looked toward the cafeteria doors, beyond which the ICU corridor stretched toward the room where Eleanor lay breathing through a machine. My wife, whose medical safeguards had been systematically removed by her own son, my retirement bled dry to finance a gallery that was already filing for bankruptcy. My family cabin, being appraised for sale while its owner lay in a coma. I stood up, tucking the envelope of cash inside my jacket, the weight of it pressed against my ribs alongside the pocket watch. Two objects carrying two very different kinds of gravity. One made of loyalty, the other made of borrowed time. Tonight I inspect my own workshop for the first time in 40 years, I said to Opal. And if I find what I think I will find, God help my son. Opal gathered her laptop and slung the bag over her shoulder. She looked at me with an expression I recognized from my own mirror. The face of someone who had already survived the worst thing a parent can endure and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. God will not help him, Raymond, she said flatly. And based on what I am seeing in these filings, the IRS might not either. The workshop door groaned as it always had, a low, familiar creak that I had heard every morning for 40 years. But at 11:15 that night, standing alone on the gravel path behind our house, with the October cold pressing against my neck, the sound felt different. It sounded like the first warning from a structure that already knew it had been hollowed out. I reached inside and pulled the chain on the overhead lamp. Yellow light spilled across the room, illuminating the space that had been my sanctuary since before Gavin could walk. The workbench stretched along the far wall, scarred and stained with 4 decades of oil and solvent. Above it hung rows of precision tools arranged by size on a pegboard I had built the year we moved in. The air held the scent of cedar shavings and machine oil, the two smells that Eleanor always said clung to my shirts like a second skin. Everything appeared to be in its proper place. That was the first warning. In 40 years of restoring antique timepieces, I have learned that the most dangerous failures are invisible. A hairspring can look perfectly coiled and still carry a fatigue fracture that will shatter under the first load of tension. A mainspring can appear fully wound, while its core is already crystallized and brittle. The things that destroy a clock are almost never the things you can see from the outside. I walked directly to the display cabinet against the north wall. Behind its glass doors sat what I believed to be my private collection. 18 antique timepieces I had acquired over a lifetime, pieces I had restored with my own hands, pieces that carried not just monetary value, but the accumulated weight of every hour I had spent learning the language of gears. The collection was worth approximately $200,000 at last appraisal. It was also worth something no dollar figure could capture. It was proof that broken things could be made whole again. I opened the cabinet and reached for the centerpiece. An 1887 Patek Philippe pocket watch with a hunter case in sterling silver. I had purchased it from an estate in Raleigh 12 years ago, spending 4 months restoring its lever escapement to factory precision. It was the finest piece I had ever owned. The moment my fingers closed around it, I knew. The weight was wrong. A genuine 1887 Patek Philippe carries the gravity of its own history in its case. A dense, particular heaviness that comes from hand-finished silver and a movement assembled by craftsmen who understood that permanence requires mass. The object in my hand carried none of that. It was lighter by at least 30 grams. The case had the right shape and the right markings, but its surface lacked the microscopic irregularities that 130 years of existence leave on genuine silver. I turned it over. The serial number engraving was sharp and uniform, machine-cut rather than hand-stamped. A replica. A very good one, but a replica nonetheless. I reached for the next piece. A 1922 Longines with a porcelain dial. Wrong. The balance wheel oscillated at the incorrect frequency. I picked up a 1903 Waltham Railroad chronometer. Wrong. The crown threading was metric instead of imperial. One by one, I lifted every timepiece from the cabinet, and one by one, the truth emerged, with the cold certainty of a diagnosis confirmed. Every single piece was counterfeit. 18 replicas had been placed inside my cabinet with meticulous care, positioned at the same angles, wound to approximate running condition. Each one a carefully constructed lie, designed to pass a casual glance. Someone had studied my collection, measured it, cataloged it, and replaced it with hollow copies. $200,000 in irreplaceable horological history, reduced to display props. He did not just steal the clocks. He erased the hours we had spent together. Every timepiece in that cabinet held a memory. The Patek Philippe was the watch I had been restoring the afternoon. Gavin came home from college and told me he wanted to be an artist. The Longines was running on my bench the morning Eleanor brought me coffee and said the word retirement for the first time. They were not inventory. They were chapters. And he had sold them and left behind forgeries to buy himself time. I moved to the security system mounted above the workbench. The camera should have held 90 days of recorded footage. When I accessed the log, the screen displayed a single message. Storage cleared. Remote access. The system log identified the IP address that had initiated the deletion. It traced back to a commercial internet account registered to Oaks Contemporary LLC. He had wiped the cameras from his gallery while I sat at Eleanor's bedside. The invasion had been digital as well as physical. I turned to the lateral file cabinet hidden behind my shelf of horological reference manuals. 30 years ago, I had installed a false panel in the bottom drawer for storing important documents. Insurance policies, the deed to the cabin, our original marriage certificate. When I slid the drawer open and removed the panel, my hands went still. Inside were documents that did not belong to me. A forged power of attorney bearing my name and a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. Beside it, stacked neatly, were practice sheets, dozens of pages filled with careful repetitions of my handwriting. My capital R, my lowercase k, the distinctive way I looped my S. He had studied the way I wrote my name with the same obsessive attention I applied to studying the movement of a Swiss escapement. Beneath the practice sheets, I found the home equity line of credit documentation. $220,000, secured against the cabin at 14 Ridgecrest Lane. My signature at the bottom. The notary stamp of Daniel Fisk. The cabin that had been in Eleanor's family for 3 generations was now collateral for debts I had never authorized. My son had not simply stolen money. He had turned my identity into a tool and my family home into a bargaining chip. Every surface he had touched was contaminated. Every document he had accessed was compromised. The workshop I had considered my most private space had been infiltrated with the quiet precision of a clockwork mechanism designed to dismantle itself from the inside. I sank into my bench chair, the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the rows of counterfeit timepieces still sitting open on the workbench. Then I noticed one final item I had not yet opened. Tucked behind the loan documents, pressed flat against the back of the false panel, was a manila folder. The tab was labeled in careful handwriting that I recognized as Gavin's. Ellie Estate. My hands did not tremble when I opened it. They had gone past trembling into a stillness that felt mechanical, as though my body had shifted into the same cold diagnostic mode I used when examining a watch movement under magnification. The first page was a change of beneficiary form for our primary life insurance policy. $500,000. My name had been crossed out. Gavin Oakes was now the sole beneficiary. The notary stamp was Daniel Fisk's. Beneath it was a second policy I had never seen before. A supplemental life insurance contract taken out in Eleanor's name 6 months ago, without her knowledge or mine. The death benefit was $300,000. The beneficiary was Gavin Oakes. I closed the folder slowly. $800,000. That was the number my son had placed on his mother's life. That was the return on investment he expected from the woman who had taught him to tie his shoes, read his first book, and hold a paintbrush. My wife's life had been appraised at $800,000. And my son was the one holding the receipt. $800,000. I sat at my workbench, staring at the number until it stopped looking like money and started looking like a motive. The overhead lamp hummed in the silence, casting yellow light across the open folder, and the counterfeit timepieces scattered across the work surface like the disassembled parts of a life. I forced myself to read every page. Both policies carried the notary stamp of Daniel Fisk. Both bore signatures that mimicked mine with the accuracy of a master forger, not a son. But the insurance documents were only the outer casing. The real mechanism was buried deeper. Behind the policies, I found a printed screenshot from Eleanor's digital health portal. The same platform Opal had shown me at the hospital. Eleanor's cardiologist had flagged her for an urgent medication adjustment in June, after her blood pressure readings exceeded safe thresholds for the third consecutive visit. A priority follow-up was scheduled for June 28th. Gavin canceled it on June 26th, 2 days before the appointment that might have saved her. He canceled the August screening. He canceled the September medication review. 3 cancellations across 4 months, each one removing another safeguard from a woman whose circulatory system was quietly building toward catastrophe. Eleanor had trusted him. She told me in September that Gavin was helping her manage her health care because the online portal confused her. She was grateful. She thought her son was taking care of her. The last item in the folder was a tablet computer Gavin had given Eleanor as a birthday present 2 years ago. I powered it on with barely enough battery to access the browsing history. The searches were not Eleanor's. Someone had used this tablet across July and August to research a series of precise medical queries. Undetected stroke triggers in elderly patients, high-altitude effects on chronic hypertension, Blue Ridge Parkway elevation at overlook points. Can high altitude cause brain hemorrhage in patients with unmanaged blood pressure? Average emergency response time rural Buncombe County. I read each entry twice. The clinical precision reminded me of how I approach a complex restoration, methodical, thorough, leaving nothing to chance. Except, this was not a restoration. It was a demolition. The Blue Ridge Overlook had not been a romantic anniversary choice. It had been a calculated variable. Gavin suggested that location 3 weeks before the dinner. He called Eleanor directly, told her the sunset view would be unforgettable. She cried because she was so pleased her son was involved in our anniversary planning. He chose the altitude. He knew her blood pressure was unmanaged because he had personally ensured it would be. He canceled every appointment designed to catch the danger. Then he pointed us toward a mountaintop and waited for physics and biology to do his work. Have you ever discovered that the person who handed you a gift was actually handing you a weapon aimed at someone you love? The realization does not strike like lightning. It seeps through you like moisture through a cracked watch case, corroding everything it touches. This was not theft. This was a slow, patient, architecturally precise attempt to end my wife's life and make it look like nature's doing. I closed the tablet and set it beside the folder. Some instinct I cannot fully explain pushed me upward, out of the workshop and into the house, up the narrow staircase to the attic. I was not looking for Christmas ornaments or tax records. I was looking for something I had buried here decades ago and never wanted to see again. I found it behind a stack of old engineering manuals. A tin box, no larger than a cigar case, spotted with rust and coated in the fine gray dust of 30 years of deliberate forgetting. I carried it to the workbench and pried the lid open. Inside were 7 letters, written in a handwriting I had not seen since I was 32. The handwriting of my father, Harold Oakes. Harold had been a watchmaker too. He taught me the trade in his Hendersonville shop before I was old enough to drive. He had gifted hands and a fatal weakness hidden behind charm. When I was 30, I discovered he had forged his own parents' signatures on financial documents, draining their savings and selling their property without their knowledge. He stole over $90,000. The scandal destroyed the family. My grandparents died within a year of each other, broken and bankrupt. Harold served 4 years in prison. I never visited him. The letters were written from his cell. I had read them once, sealed them in this tin, and carried them to the attic, like a body being buried in an unmarked grave. Now I read them again under the workshop lamp, and Harold's words carried the same mixture of manufactured remorse and entitlement I had heard in Gavin's voice 2 nights ago. "You owe me more than this small life," Harold had written to his own father. I was meant for more than fixing other people's broken things. I set the letter down and opened my phone. Opal had forwarded me an email Gavin sent to a New York art dealer 3 months ago. The old man doesn't appreciate what he has. I am liberating these pieces from a life that was never going to use them properly. 2 generations. 2 voices. The same language of entitlement. Harold dismantled his parents with forged documents and quiet greed. Now Gavin was following the same blueprint, using the same tools, as though the defective gear I had buried in this attic had replicated itself inside my own son, and I was the one who had allowed it. I hid Harold's history because I was ashamed. I never told Eleanor the full truth about my father's crimes. I never warned Gavin about the pattern running through our bloodline like a fracture through steel. I buried the broken gear instead of removing it, and now it was grinding through another generation. I hid you. I whispered to the letters spread across my workbench, and the rot kept growing. A clock does not choose to be broken, but the man who sees the broken gear and leaves it inside the mechanism, he has made a choice. And that choice has consequences that echo forward through every hour the clock continues to run. I picked up my phone. Nearly 2 in the morning. The call connected on the second ring. "Miranda, this is Raymond Oakes. I need a criminal attorney, a forensic accountant, and a detective who specializes in elder fraud. My son is not just a thief. He is a blueprint of a man I buried 30 years ago. And I am finished letting the pattern repeat." I did not walk into the law firm. I carried the wreckage in with me. The briefcase felt heavier than any toolbox I had ever lifted, though it contained nothing but paper and the shattered remains of a family I thought I understood. Miranda Chen's office occupied the 7th floor of a glass-fronted building on Patton Avenue, overlooking the rooftops of downtown Asheville. The reception area was clean and precise. Everything aligned at right angles. The kind of environment that told you the person who worked here believed disorder was a professional failure. When her assistant showed me in, Miranda was already standing behind her desk. A woman of 43 with a sharp jaw, dark eyes, and a posture that suggested she had never once leaned back in a chair during a meeting. "Mr. Oakes," she said, extending a hand. "Sit down and show me everything." I opened the briefcase and spread the contents across her mahogany desk the way I would lay out the disassembled components of a broken movement. The forged power of attorney, the signature practice sheets, the HELOC documentation for the cabin, the beneficiary change forms, the insurance policies, the printed search history from the tablet. the canceled medical appointments. I arranged each piece in chronological order. Because evidence, like clockwork, only makes sense when you can see the sequence. Miranda studied each document without speaking. Her fingers moved from page to page with a controlled efficiency that reminded me of a surgeon examining imaging scans. When she reached the tablet search history, she stopped. She read the entries twice, then looked up at me with an expression I had not yet seen on her face. Her professional composure had cracked, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in tempered glass. "I have handled elder financial abuse cases for 12 years, she said carefully. "I have seen children drain their parents' savings, forge signatures, manipulate inheritance documents, but I have never seen a child research how to trigger their mother's stroke." She closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the desk. "This is not a civil matter, Mr. Oakes. This is criminal. And you need more than an attorney. You need law enforcement." As though the statement had summoned him, a knock came at the office door. Miranda's assistant stepped aside to reveal a man in a rumpled navy suit whose face carried the permanent weariness of someone who had spent 2 decades watching families cannibalize themselves over money. Detective Anthony Ruiz, 52 years old, Financial Crimes Division, Buncombe County. Miranda had called him before I arrived. His handshake was firm, his eyes quick and assessing, and when he sat down across from me, he pulled out a notebook that was already half filled with notes. "Mr. Oakes," he said, clicking his pen. "Your son's gallery has been on our radar for 7 months. We opened a preliminary investigation into Oakes' contemporary for suspected tax evasion and fraudulent billing practices last spring, but we did not have enough to move forward." He looked at the documents spread across Miranda's desk. "Until now." He picked up the forged power of attorney and examined the notary stamp. "Daniel Fisk. I know this name. He was flagged in a separate fraud case involving forged property transfer documents in Henderson County last year. If he is tied to your son's operation, that connects Gavin to a broader network of document fraud." Ruiz studied the search history printout for a long time. His pen stopped moving. The room went quiet, except for the muffled hum of traffic 7 floors below. "This is not just a paper trail anymore, Mr. Oakes," he said, his voice dropping. "This is a crime scene, with a pulse." Miranda outlined the charges while Ruiz took notes. 6 felony counts: elder financial abuse, forgery, theft by swindle, insurance fraud, medical fraud for the deliberate cancellation of critical healthcare services, and the heaviest charge, attempted manslaughter by negligence, based on the evidence that Gavin had systematically removed Eleanor's medical safeguards while researching the precise conditions that could trigger a fatal event. 6 charges. I listened to each one with the same detached precision I used when documenting a condemned mechanism. Each count was a gear tooth. Together, they formed a complete movement. The mechanical architecture of my son's betrayal laid out in legal terminology. "Once you sign this complaint, Raymond, there is no family dinner reconciliation," Ruiz said, placing the formal document in front of me. "This is the state of North Carolina versus Gavin Oakes." I looked at the pen on the desk. My entire career had been defined by my hands, their steadiness, their precision, their ability to hold the smallest screw without trembling. Now they were being asked to sign a document that would send my only child to prison. "My son killed family dinners long before I picked up this pen," I said. The ink was dry before Ruiz finished writing the case number. Miranda filed the complaint electronically, while Ruiz made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. When he hung up, his expression had shifted into something harder. An investigator who had just confirmed a suspicion he had been holding in reserve. "There is one more thing you should know," he said. "Our digital monitoring flagged an access attempt on your personal medical records last Tuesday. Someone using credentials linked to Oakes' contemporary tried to pull your full patient history from the Mission Hospital network." I felt the air in the room compress. "My medical records. They were looking for a diagnosis, Raymond. Anything they could use. Cognitive decline, memory issues, neurological complaints. Our analyst believes the access attempt was preparation for a competency challenge. He paused. Your son was not just planning to take your money and your home. He was building a case to have you declared mentally unfit. If he succeeded, he would gain legal control over every remaining asset, including your wife's medical decisions. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the arm of the chair with the same force I used to hold a watch case steady under magnification. He was not just stealing my past. He was trying to erase my future, to lock me inside a legal cage where my own voice would carry no weight and my own name would belong to someone else. We need a warrant for his gallery server, Ruiz continued, standing up and tucking the notebook into his jacket. There is a folder on that system he believes he deleted. Our tech team has already detected the ghost of it. He looked at me, and Raymond. There is a recording on that server you need to hear before we move. Your son, talking about your wife in terms that will make this case airtight. What recording? Ruiz buttoned his jacket. Your son discussing your wife's breathing as though it were a budget line that needed to be cut. The digital forensics lab smelled of ozone and overworked cooling fans. The scent of machines running at full capacity to peel back the layers of someone else's deception. Detective Ruiz led me through a keycard-secured door into a narrow room lined with monitors and processing towers, their indicator lights blinking in rhythms that reminded me of the pulse of a clock movement under stress. A young tech analyst sat at the central terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the rapid precision of someone accustomed to extracting truth from systems designed to hide it. She glanced up briefly when we entered, then returned her attention to the screen. We bypassed the primary encryption an hour ago, she told Ruiz without looking away from the display. The folder was buried inside 3 layers of mislabeled directories. He named the outer shell Tax Receipts 2023. The inner folders were password-protected with rotating keys linked to his gallery's billing software. Clever architecture. But nothing we have not cracked before. The folder's real name appeared on the screen in clean white text against a dark background. Final collection. Ruiz pulled a chair beside the terminal and gestured for me to sit. Take your time with this, Raymond. But understand that everything you see in here will be entered into evidence. The first layer was financial. A spreadsheet tracking Gavin's personal debts revealed the engine behind the entire operation. $600,000 in losses from speculative investments in digital art tokens. He had poured money into the market during its peak, buying virtual certificates for artwork that existed only as code on a blockchain. When the market collapsed, his portfolio evaporated overnight. The gallery's operating accounts were drained within weeks. The Chapter 11 filing was not a strategic business decision. It was a life raft thrown from a ship that was already underwater. $600,000. He had gambled away more than I had earned in a decade, chasing a currency that had no weight, no gears, no physical presence in the world. And when the digital house of cards fell, he turned to the only tangible assets he could reach. Mine. The second layer was an inventory, a detailed spreadsheet cataloging every timepiece he had removed from my workshop. 14 pieces in total, each one listed with its provenance, estimated auction value, and the name of the dealer or auction house through which it had been sold. The sales had been conducted anonymously through a consignment firm in Manhattan. Total proceeds, $178,000. He had kept meticulous records of his theft, as though documenting it somehow made it professional rather than criminal. I scanned the list and found the 1887 Patek Philippe near the top. Sold for $41,000 to a private collector in Connecticut. The 1922 Longines, $14,000. Each entry carried a date and a transaction number. The kind of clean bookkeeping that a forensic accountant would call a gift from heaven. But it was the third layer that stopped my breathing. The plan was titled Final Collection, and it was exactly what the name implied. A comprehensive, step-by-step blueprint for liquidating every remaining asset in my life. The cabin at 14 Ridgecrest Lane was to be sold through a private listing, with closing scheduled for 30 days after Eleanor's projected passing. The workshop and all remaining tools were to be auctioned as a single lot to a private collector Gavin had already contacted, and Raymond Oakes himself was to be placed in a long-term care facility under involuntary guardianship, effectively removing me from every decision, every asset, and every remaining fragment of the life I had spent 4 decades building. The guardianship petition was already drafted. Attached to it was a psychological evaluation form, partially completed, diagnosing me with early-onset cognitive decline, consistent with dementia. The form bore the letterhead of a medical clinic in West Asheville, where Gavin had completed an interior design project the previous year. The evaluating physician's signature was as fabricated as every other document in this folder. I read the diagnosis line by line. Patient exhibits disorientation, increasing confusion, inability to manage personal affairs, and progressive short-term memory loss consistent with moderate-stage dementia. I set my jaw and spoke to the empty air between the monitors. I have spent 40 years restoring mechanisms that most people considered beyond repair. I can identify a counterfeit movement at 20 paces, and my son wrote that I cannot manage my own shoelaces. Ruiz leaned forward. There is more. He had already contacted the facility, a place called Ridgeview Pines in Marion. Secured memory care wing. Restricted visitor access. He scheduled a tour for himself 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner. 3 weeks. He had walked through the locked corridors of my future prison while Eleanor and I sat at home discussing what restaurant to choose for our celebration. The tour was booked under a false name, but the facility's visitor log captured his vehicle registration, the black Range Rover. He was not just planning to take you home, Raymond, Ruiz said quietly. He was planning to erase you. Lock you in a room with a view of a parking lot and let the paperwork bury you alive. Have you ever looked at a blueprint for your own disappearance? It does not feel like reading a document. It feels like standing at the edge of a grave that someone has already measured to your exact dimensions. The tech analyst spoke up from behind her monitor. Detective, we have the audio file. It was embedded in a subfolder labeled Archive. Time-stamped August 19th. Recorded through the gallery's internal communication system. Ruiz looked at me. I nodded. She pressed play. The speakers crackled briefly, then my son's voice filled the room, casual and unhurried, as though he were discussing a color palette for a client's living room. The old man is sentimental about those clocks. The way Mom is sentimental about breathing. Both problems solve themselves if you just stop winding. The room went silent. The cooling fans hummed. The monitor lights blinked their steady mechanical pulse. I sat perfectly still, feeling the words settle into my chest like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove. Stop winding. He had taken the language of my craft, the vocabulary I had used to teach him about patience and precision and the value of keeping things alive, and he had turned it into a metaphor for letting his mother die. Ruiz closed the laptop. The blue light faded from his glasses, leaving his eyes dark and hard. The arrest warrant is signed, Raymond. Tactical team assembles at 0500. By 0600, your son will be in handcuffs. I stood up, my joints protesting after hours in the cold plastic chair. The lab felt smaller now, compressed by the weight of what I had just heard. I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to Ruiz. Detective, when you arrest him, make sure he is awake. I want him to know exactly what time it is. Eleanor opened her eyes on a Wednesday afternoon, and the world she saw was a perfect copy of the past, clean, intact, and entirely wrong. I was sitting beside her bed when it happened, the same hard plastic chair I had occupied for more hours than I could count, the pocket watch ticking its patient rhythm against my ribs. The monitors had been showing stable patterns all morning, the kind of quiet green lines that lull you into believing the crisis has passed. Then, her fingers moved. A small contraction, barely visible, like the first tremor of a mainspring beginning to uncoil after years of dormancy. Her eyelids fluttered. She turned her head slowly on the pillow, squinting against the fluorescent light as though she had just surfaced from very deep water. Raymond, she said, her voice thin and rough, like a sound traveling through rusted pipe. "Why is it so bright in here?" I leaned forward and took her hand. Her skin was cool and papery, but her grip had more strength than I expected. She looked at me with a confused half-smile, the expression of someone trying to remember whether they had left the stove on. "Where is Gavin?" "He was supposed to meet me for lunch at the gallery. He wanted to show me the new installation." She was talking about a lunch from 8 months ago. A lunch I vaguely remembered her mentioning in February, back when the world still made sense and my son was still, as far as I knew, merely a struggling artist with expensive taste, rather than a calculated predator wearing my family's name like a borrowed coat. "Ellie, take it slow," I said, keeping my voice level. "You have been asleep for a while." Dr. Aris, the young neurologist who had been managing Eleanor's recovery, explained the situation to me in the hallway while a nurse checked her vitals. Retrograde amnesia. The hemorrhage and subsequent surgery had erased approximately 8 months of Eleanor's memory, conveniently eliminating every moment during which Gavin's operation had escalated from quiet theft to active conspiracy. "Her brain has essentially built a bypass around the trauma," he said, choosing his words with clinical care. "She remembers everything up to about February of this year. The months between then and the accident are, for the moment, inaccessible. They may return gradually, or they may not return at all." 8 months. The exact window during which Gavin had canceled her medical appointments, forged my signature on insurance documents, sold our timepieces through anonymous auctions, and researched how altitude and unmanaged blood pressure could combine to kill her. Her mind had sealed away the precise period of her son's most active betrayal, leaving behind only the version of Gavin she wanted to remember. The sweet artistic boy who brought her lavender lattes and talked about color theory as though it were a form of prayer. When I returned to her room, Eleanor was sitting up straighter, her eyes sharper, her tone carrying a growing urgency that made the heart monitor beep faster. "Raymond, I asked you where Gavin is. Why will you not answer me?" I sat down and took a breath. There is no manual for this. No technical reference guide for the moment when you must tell your wife that the child she adores tried to engineer her death for an insurance payout. I had rehearsed a dozen approaches in my mind. Gentle ones, gradual ones, clinical ones. None of them survived contact with the look in her eyes. "Gavin has been arrested, Ellie. He has been charged with 6 felonies related to financial fraud and endangering your health." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. "I know because the pocket watch was in my hand." "That is absurd." Her voice was not angry yet. It was the voice of someone correcting a factual error, the way she used to correct misspelled words on library catalog cards. "Gavin would never do anything to hurt us. He is under pressure with the gallery, that is all. You have never understood the stress he carries. He stole $375,000 from our retirement accounts. He forged my signature on loan documents. He changed the beneficiary on your life insurance to himself. Stop it, Raymond. He canceled your cardiology appointments. He researched stroke triggers on a tablet he gave you as a gift. He chose the Blue Ridge overlook for our anniversary, because he knew the altitude would be dangerous for someone with uncontrolled blood pressure." Eleanor's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The monitors beside her bed began to climb, the steady green lines sharpening into agitated peaks. She pulled her hand away from mine with a force that startled us both. "You have always resented his creativity," she said, her voice rising. "You wanted him to be a repairman like you, hunched over someone else's broken things for the rest of his life. He chose something bigger, and you have never forgiven him for it." She was breathing hard now, her chest rising and falling beneath the hospital gown. "You drove him away, Raymond. Whatever financial mistakes he made, you pushed him to it." I let her finish. I had learned long ago that arguing with pain only makes it louder. When the echo of her words faded into the beeping monitors, I reached into the bag beside my chair and pulled out the evidence I had brought specifically for this moment. The signature practice sheets. Dozens of pages covered in careful repetitions of my handwriting. Every stroke studied and replicated. with the obsessive precision of a forger perfecting a tool. I spread them across her blanket without saying a word. Eleanor looked down. Her breathing slowed. I watched her eyes move across the rows of practiced letters. The familiar slant of my capital R, reproduced again and again in her son's handwriting. I placed the auction receipts beside them. 14 timepieces sold through a Manhattan consignment house. And then I set down the last document, the one I knew would break through every wall her mind had built. A receipt for the sale of a 1946 Elgin pocket watch with a gold-filled hunter case, sold to a private dealer in New York for $14,000. It was the pocket watch that had belonged to Eleanor's father, the one she had placed in Gavin's hands when he was 7 years old, kneeling beside him on the living room carpet, teaching him to press it against his ear and listen to the tiny heartbeat inside. Her fingers hovered over the receipt. They did not touch it. They trembled above the paper the way hands tremble above a flame, wanting to verify the heat, but afraid of the burn. He sold my father's watch? Her voice was barely audible, a whisper stripped of every defense. The one I put in his hands when he was 7? I did not answer. The receipt answered for me. Eleanor's face did not crumble the way I had expected. It did not collapse into sobs or contort into rage. Instead, something far more devastating happened. She went quiet, a deep, structural quiet that I recognized from my own experience. The silence of a mechanism that has just lost its mainspring and is coasting on the last stored energy before it stops completely. I gave him time, Raymond, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the receipt, every minute of it. And he sold it by the ounce. She sat with those words for a long time, her hands resting on the papers spread across her lap, the monitors beeping their steady, indifferent count beside her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry and clear, carrying a sharpness that I had not seen since before the overlook. "Call the attorney," she said. "I want to testify." She reached out and gripped my forearm with a strength that surprised us both. "And Raymond, bring me that pocket watch. Your pocket watch. The one my father gave you. If it still exists, I want to hold it one more time before I hold it up in a courtroom." The phone rang for the first time on a Tuesday evening, 6 days after they took him. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a plate that Eleanor had used for the first solid meal she had eaten since waking, a small portion of chicken broth and toast that she managed with her left hand while her right gripped the edge of the hospital tray for balance. I had just driven home from Mission Hospital, the taste of vending machine coffee still coating the back of my throat, when the landline on the kitchen counter began to vibrate against the wood. The caller identification display read Buncombe County Jail. I stared at it. The phone rang 4 times, then 5, then 6. Each ring pulsed through the quiet kitchen like the tick of a clock, counting down toward something I was not yet ready to face. I let it ring until the answering system activated, and the automated voice began its rehearsed script. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Buncombe County Detention Facility. Press 1 to accept." I did not press 1. I stood at the sink with the warm plate in my hands and waited for silence to return. When it did, I dried the plate, placed it in the cabinet, and opened a fresh notebook from the drawer beside the telephone. At the top of the first page, I wrote the date, the time, and the duration of the ring. Beneath it, I noted the caller identification number. I treated it exactly the way I would treat an inspection log, recording each data point with the detached precision of a man, documenting the stress patterns on a failing structure. Emotion had no place in this ledger, only facts. The second call came the following morning at 7:14. The third arrived at noon. By the end of that first week, the notebook held 11 entries, each one cataloged with the same clinical discipline: time, duration, caller identification, result, unanswered. Have you ever watched a phone ring and felt nothing? Not anger, not grief, not even the pull of curiosity, just the flat, mechanical observation of a signal arriving from a place you have already decided does not exist. That is what silence sounds like when it becomes a choice rather than an absence. The calls continued through the second week. 12, 15, 20. They arrived at unpredictable intervals, sometimes clustered in the early morning, sometimes spaced hours apart, as though the person on the other end was testing different times to find the crack in my resolve. There was no crack. The notebook filled with entries, and I filled my days with the work of rebuilding what he had tried to destroy. Eleanor was transferred from Mission Hospital to an outpatient rehabilitation center on the 9th day after waking. By the 14th day, she was walking with a cane, her steps slow but deliberate. Each one placed with the careful intention of a woman who had decided that falling down again was not an option she would accept. I visited every morning and stayed until the afternoon light began to fade. We did not talk about Gavin. We talked about the greenhouse she wanted to build behind the cabin, the books she had been meaning to read, the way the October light fell across the Blue Ridge in the late afternoon. We talked about everything that was still standing. Opal came by the house 3 times that week, each visit accompanied by a laptop and a stack of printed records. She had traced the full financial timeline now. 14 months of structured extraction mapped across spreadsheets that she spread across my kitchen table like architectural blueprints. Total documented losses, including the retirement fund, the home equity line, the counterfeit watch replacements, and the insurance policy alterations, exceeded $700,000. The number was staggering. But what struck me harder was the precision. Every transfer had been timed to avoid automated alerts. Every forgery had been notarized by the same man. Every digital trail had been rerouted through the same compromised email address. It was not impulsive. It was engineered. He treated your life like a project, Opal said, closing her laptop after the 3rd visit. A renovation he was performing on a building he planned to demolish. Between hospital visits and Opal's forensic briefings, I began the slow process of removing Gavin's presence from the house. I took down the photographs first, his gap-toothed school portrait from 2nd grade, the soccer trophies he held in muddy hands, the college graduation picture where he stood beneath a navy cap and gown looking like a young man with a future worth protecting. I did not throw them away. I placed them in a cardboard box and carried the box to the attic, setting it beside the tin that held Harold's letters. 2 generations of evidence, stored in the same dark space. In the living room, I found a framed print Gavin had given us 2 Christmases ago, an abstract piece from his gallery that he claimed was worth several $1,000s. I turned it over and found a sticker on the backing from a wholesale art supply company in Charlotte. Retail price, $47. Even his gifts had been counterfeits. By the 23rd day, the notebook held 37 entries. 37 calls from a detention facility 40 minutes away, and not one of them had been answered. The phone had become a metronome measuring the distance between who my son used to be and who he had become. Each unanswered ring another tick of the clock moving forward without him. I sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday night, the notebook open before me. The overhead light casting a small circle of yellow warmth against the autumn darkness pressing at the windows. The pocket watch lay beside the notebook, its second hand sweeping its faithful circuit. Eleanor was asleep at the rehabilitation center. Opal had gone home. The house was quiet in the way that only empty houses can be, a silence that does not feel peaceful but pressurized, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. The phone rang. 38 on the display log. Buncombe County Jail. I looked at the notebook. 37 entries. Each one a small act of refusal. 37 times I had chosen silence over engagement, boundary over bridge. But this time, something was different. Not in the ring itself, which sounded exactly the same as everyone before it. The difference was in me. I was ready. I opened the voice recording application on my cell phone and pressed the red button. The small microphone icon pulsed steadily on the screen, capturing every sound in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the house settling, the measured tick of the pocket watch. Then I reached for the landline and pressed 1. "Dad?" His voice broke through the speaker like water through a cracked dam, frantic and raw, and nothing like the polished instrument I had heard in the hospital corridor weeks ago. "Oh, thank God. Dad." You have to get me out of here. I said nothing. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and the recorder running on the table beside me, and I waited for him to fill the silence with exactly who he was. I stood at my workbench with the phone pressed against my ear, the voice recorder's red light pulsing like a second heartbeat beside the lamp. Gavin's breathing came through in shallow, uneven bursts, the kind of rhythm I'd associate with a mainspring wound past its limit. 23 days of silence. 37 ignored calls. And now his voice filled my workshop like smoke, seeping under a locked door. Dad, you have to get me out of here. He repeated it slower, as if repetition could reshape the words into something I might accept. They put me in a cell with a man who talks to himself all night. I haven't slept in 4 days. My lawyer says if you post the bond, I can be home by morning. I let the silence stretch. In my trade, you learn that the space between ticks is where the truth lives. A clock running perfectly smooth with no pause between beats is broken. It's the hesitation, the tiny fraction of stillness, that proves the mechanism is sound. So I waited and let Gavin fill the emptiness with whatever he chose. Are you listening? Dad, I'm talking to you. This place is not what you think. I'm not some criminal. Everything I did because the gallery was drowning. Investors pulled out. The NFT market collapsed overnight. $600,000 in digital assets turned to vapor. I was trying to save something. You were trying to save something, I repeated, keeping my voice level, the way I'd speak to a customer explaining why their grandfather's watch had stopped. No accusation. Just a mirror held steady. Tell me what you were saving when you canceled your mother's cardiology appointment on June 26th. The line went quiet. I could hear the jail's ventilation system humming in the distance, a low mechanical drone like the old dehumidifier in my workshop. When Gavin spoke again, his voice had shifted registers, dropping from desperation into something colder. That was a scheduling conflict. Her portal flagged a double booking. I fixed it. You fixed it 3 times. June, August, September. 3 cancellations in 4 months, each one removing a safeguard that kept her blood pressure from becoming a death sentence. And then you searched on that tablet you gave her for stroke triggers in elderly patients and high-altitude effects on chronic hypertension. You picked the Blue Ridge overlook, Gavin. You picked the place where her heart would do the work for you. I heard him swallow, the sound amplified through the jail's phone system, wet and sharp, like a gear slipping its tooth. That's insane. You're making connections that don't exist. I looked those things up because I was worried about her condition. Then why did you change the beneficiary on both life insurance policies to yourself? $500,000 on the primary, $300,000 on the supplemental, $800,000. That's what your mother's breathing was worth to you. A budget line that needed to be cut. Wasn't that the phrase? The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted them the way I count oscillations of a balance wheel during calibration. Each second a full swing. Each swing a chance for truth. That recording was taken out of context. I was speaking metaphorically about gallery expenses. Whoever gave that to the police manipulated the file. Your own server held that file. Your own encryption protected it. Your own voice said the words. Detective Ruiz has the original, certified, unaltered by the forensic lab. Every syllable is yours, Gavin. He began to cry. Or at least he produced the sounds associated with crying. I had watched this boy grow up in my workshop, had taught him to hold a loop steady and clean a jewel bearing with a brush thinner than an eyelash. I knew every frequency of his voice, every genuine tremor, and every performed one. What came through the phone was a performance, the pitch too even, the sobs too rhythmic, like a metronome set to elicit sympathy at 60 beats per minute. Dad, I'm your son. Whatever mistakes I made, I'm still your son. Mom would want you to help me. Your mother asked me to bring your grandfather's pocket watch to the courtroom. The one you didn't manage to sell because I kept it locked in a place you never found. She wants to hold it when she testifies. She wants something real in her hand while she tells 12 strangers what you did to her. She's going to testify? His voice sharpened. She can barely remember last month. Her amnesia makes her unreliable. My lawyer already said her testimony won't hold. There it was. Not grief, not remorse, not even honest fear. Strategy. My son, sitting in a cell he called unbearable, was already calculating how to discredit his mother's memory before she reached the stand. A watchmaker learns to identify the moment a component fails. It's rarely dramatic. No explosion, no shattering glass. Just a tiny fracture in a tiny wheel, invisible to the naked eye but absolute in its consequence. The mechanism stops, and you realize it stopped long before you notice the silence. Gavin, listen carefully because I will say this once. I spent 30 years hiding what your grandfather did. I buried his letters, erased his name, let you grow up believing this family had no cracks. That was my failure. I handed you a clean clock face and never showed you the broken gears behind it. But I will not make that mistake again. Every forged signature, every wire transfer, every search query, every canceled appointment, every stolen dollar will be laid open in that courtroom. Not because I want to destroy you, because this cycle stops with me. 7 seconds of nothing. Then the automated system announced 30 seconds remaining. You'll regret this, he whispered. When this is over, you'll have nothing left. I already had nothing left, son. You made sure of that 14 months ago. The line went dead. I set the phone beside the recorder, pressed stop, and labeled the file with 3 words heavier than any diagnosis I'd written on a repair tag. 38. Final call. Eleanor would begin courtroom preparation with Miranda Chen in 6 days. Opal had completed the forensic timeline, $700,000 mapped across 14 months. Detective Ruiz confirmed Daniel Fisk had agreed to cooperate for reduced charges. The prosecution now had the notary, the documents, the digital trail, and the recorded voice of a son who measured his mother's life in policy numbers. I picked up my grandfather's pocket watch from the velvet tray. The case was warm from the lamp, and when I opened it, the face read 9:17, the exact time Eleanor first opened her eyes after the coma. I wound the watch, 3 clicks, and set it back. 40 hours on a full wind. More than enough to reach the moment when my son would hear his own words, played to 12 people, who would decide what silence costs. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the only honest sound left in the room. Tick, tick, tick. Miranda Chen arrived at our cabin on Ridgecrest Lane at 7 in the morning, 6 days before the trial, carrying 2 banker's boxes and a leather binder thick enough to stop a bullet. She wore no jewelry except a single silver watch on her left wrist. And when she set the boxes on my kitchen table, she aligned them with the edge, the way I align caseback screws before reassembly. I liked her immediately for that precision. In my experience, people who respect the geometry of small objects tend to respect the architecture of truth. Eleanor sat across from her in the wheelchair Opal had brought from the rehab center, a wool blanket over her knees despite the October warmth. Her left hand still trembled from the nerve damage. A faint oscillation that reminded me of an unbalanced wheel. Not broken, just seeking its center. She had been practicing her grip on a rubber ball every morning, squeezing it 40 times with each hand, because she wanted to hold the pocket watch in court without dropping it. That detail, the image of my wife rehearsing the strength to hold a dead man's timepiece in front of the son who tried to kill her, settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Miranda opened the leather binder and laid out the trial strategy in the plain, unhurried language of someone accustomed to translating catastrophe into courtroom procedure. The prosecution would present the case in 4 phases. Phase 1 would establish the financial crimes, the 63 wire transfers totaling $375,000, the forged power of attorney, the HELOC of $220,000 on our cabin, all documented through bank records, notary filings, and Opal's forensic timeline. Phase 2 would address the insurance fraud, the beneficiary changes on both policies, totaling $800,000, notarized by Daniel Fisk, who had signed a cooperation agreement with the district attorney's office 11 days ago. Phase 3 would present the medical evidence, the 3 canceled appointments, the tablet search history, and the expert testimony of a cardiologist who would explain precisely how untreated hypertension at high altitude could trigger a hemorrhagic stroke. Phase 4 would deliver the emotional impact, Eleanor's testimony, the recorded phone call, and the pocket watch. "The watch matters," Miranda said, tapping a note in her binder. "Jurors remember objects. They forget dates and dollar amounts within hours. But they remember what a witness held in their hands. When Eleanor takes the stand with that pocket watch, the jury won't just see evidence. They'll see inheritance. They'll see what was supposed to be passed down and what was stolen instead." She turned to Eleanor and spoke with a directness that carried no softness, but also no cruelty. "Mrs. Oakes, your memory gap covers 8 months. The defense will exploit this. They'll ask you about events from March through October, and when you can't recall them, they'll suggest that your entire testimony is unreliable. I need you to understand something. You are not testifying about what you remember. You are testifying about what you know. You know your son's voice. You know your own signature. And when they show you the forged documents, you will tell the jury that the handwriting is not yours. That requires no memory of the past 8 months. That requires only the truth." Eleanor nodded once, the way she used to nod when I explained a particularly delicate repair, absorbing the information before committing to a response. "What if they ask me whether I love my son?" Miranda closed her binder. "Tell them the truth. The truth is, I don't know anymore. And I think that's worse than any answer they're expecting." I left the room after that. Not because I couldn't bear it, but because some calibrations need to happen without an audience. I walked to my workshop and opened the velvet tray where my grandfather's pocket watch rested. The Waltham Model 1883, railroad grade. Adjusted to 5 positions, with a double-sunk porcelain dial that had survived 2 wars and a house fire. My father had given it to me the week before his trial, pressing it into my palm with hands that shook from something deeper than cold. "Keep it wound," he had said. "A stopped clock tells you nothing about where you've been." I had kept it wound for 40 years. 3 clicks every morning. A ritual as automatic as breathing. Now it carried the weight of 3 generations. My grandfather's pride, my father's shame, and my son's betrayal, all housed in a case no larger than a silver dollar. When I returned to the kitchen, Miranda was walking Eleanor through the specific documents she would be shown on the stand. The forged power of attorney with its imitation of Eleanor's signature. The loops too perfect, the pressure too uniform, lacking the slight leftward drift that decades of writing had embedded in her hand. The insurance beneficiary forms, both dated and notarized within 6 weeks of each other, bearing a version of Eleanor's name written by someone who had practiced it on sheets of paper, now sitting in an evidence locker. The medical portal screenshots, showing appointment cancellations made from an IP address registered to Oakes Contemporary LLC. For each document, Miranda instructed, "I will ask you one question. Is this your signature? You will answer no. That is all. Do not explain. Do not elaborate. Do not look at your son. Look at the jury. Let them see your hands." Eleanor lifted her trembling left hand from the blanket and held it in the lamplight. "They'll see enough," she said quietly. Detective Ruiz arrived at noon with a final update. Daniel Fisk had completed his deposition the previous afternoon, confirming under oath that Gavin Oakes had personally directed every forged document, provided the signature samples, and paid Fisk $12,000 across 4 installments to notarize the fraudulent filings. Fisk also confirmed that Gavin had visited his office 17 days before the anniversary dinner to request a rush notarization of the supplemental life insurance beneficiary change, stating, and Fisk quoted this precisely, "It needs to be done before the trip." "Before the trip," I repeated. The words landed in the room like a clock striking an hour no one wanted to reach. The Blue Ridge overlook was not a spontaneous anniversary idea. It was a deadline. My son had notarized his mother's death benefits 17 days in advance and then suggested the location where her untreated blood pressure would face 5,000 feet of elevation. Every detail calibrated, every contingency mapped, every exit planned, except the one where his father refused to stay silent. Miranda gathered her materials and stood. 6 days, Mr. Oakes. I need Eleanor rested, steady, and ready to hold that watch without shaking. Can you manage that? I looked at my wife, who was already squeezing the rubber ball again, her jaw set with the particular determination of a woman who had survived a fractured skull, an 8-month amnesia, and the discovery that her only child had priced her life at $800,000. Her grip tightened around the ball, released, tightened again. A rhythm, a practice, a preparation for the weight of something that no hand should ever have to carry. She'll be ready, I said. She's been ready since she opened her eyes. That night I wound the pocket watch 3 clicks and set it on Eleanor's bedside table so she could hear it ticking while she slept. 40 hours of stored energy, 6 days until the courtroom. And somewhere in a cell 22 miles south, my son was preparing his defense against the sound of his own voice, saying words that no amount of legal strategy could unsay. The gears were set. The hands were moving. And for the first time in 14 months, the time they kept was mine. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old wood, the kind of scent you find in places designed to outlast the people who pass through them. Buncombe County Superior Court. Room 3, built in 1941, with oak benches worn smooth by 85 years of witnesses, defendants, and families who entered through the same double doors, carrying vastly different versions of the same events. I arrived at 7:32 in the morning, 48 minutes before the session began, because a man who has spent his life calibrating instruments to fractions of a second does not arrive late to the moment that will define every remaining minute he has left. Eleanor came in at 8, pushed by Opal in the wheelchair we had borrowed from the rehab center. She wore a navy blue dress that Miranda had selected specifically because it conveyed dignity without performance, and her hair was pulled back in the simple twist she had worn on our wedding day 40 years and 11 days ago. In her lap, resting on the wool blanket, was my grandfather's Waltham pocket watch in its silver case. She had practiced holding it every evening for 6 days, building the strength in her trembling left hand until she could grip it for a full 90 seconds without faltering. I had timed her. 90 seconds. The average duration of a critical witness answer, according to Miranda. Gavin sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit I did not recognize, his hair freshly cut, his posture arranged into an expression of composed concern that I imagined his attorney had rehearsed with him. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at me. He looked straight ahead at a point somewhere above the judge's bench, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else in a room he was merely visiting. I had seen that detachment before. In my father's eyes, the morning the bailiff read his charges aloud, and Harold Oakes stared at the ceiling as though the words were rain falling on someone else's roof. Prosecutor Diane Alderman opened with a statement that lasted 11 minutes. She was 53, a former bank fraud specialist, who had transferred to the district attorney's office after prosecuting a case involving a son who had embezzled his elderly mother's pension through a series of forged instruments. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who trusted the evidence to do the work. She told the jury that over the course of 14 months, Gavin Oakes had systematically dismantled the financial, medical, and physical safety of his own parents through a coordinated campaign of forgery, theft, insurance fraud, and deliberate medical neglect, and that the evidence would show this campaign culminated in a calculated attempt to place his mother in a situation designed to trigger a fatal medical event. The first phase unfolded exactly as Miranda had outlined. Opal Whitfield took the stand and presented the forensic financial timeline: 63 structured wire transfers totaling $375,000 from Raymond Oakes' retirement accounts to Oakes Contemporary LLC. She had printed each transaction on a separate sheet, dated and annotated. And as she described them one by one, the jury watched the numbers accumulate, like water rising in a locked room. The $220,000 HELOC on 14 Ridgecrest Lane. The forged durable power of attorney filed with the county clerk. The fake email address created to intercept bank correspondence. Opal delivered each fact in the same measured tone she had used for 31 years at the North Carolina Department of Revenue. And when the defense attorney objected that the financial records were circumstantial, Judge Patricia Hollowell overruled him without hesitation. Daniel Fisk testified next. Escorted from a holding area in a gray suit that hung loose on his frame, as though the man inside had shrunk since the last time it fit. He confirmed everything. 4 notarizations, $12,000 in payments, signature samples provided by Gavin in manila envelopes, and the rush request 17 days before the anniversary. When Prosecutor Alderman asked him to read aloud the words Gavin had used during that final visit, Fisk cleared his throat and recited them in a voice so flat it carried the weight of a confession that had already cost him his license. "It needs to be done before the trip. She won't be needing the old beneficiary after that." The second sentence was new. Fisk had withheld it during his initial deposition, releasing it only after his attorney negotiated final terms with the prosecution. The courtroom shifted. I heard the intake of breath from the second row, where a woman in a red cardigan pressed her hand to her mouth. Gavin's attorney requested a sidebar. Judge Hollowell denied it. Phase 3 brought Dr. Anand Mehta, a cardiologist from Duke University Medical Center, who explained in precise clinical language how 3 consecutive cancellations of blood pressure management appointments over 4 months would allow chronic hypertension to escalate unchecked, and how exposure to elevations above 4,000 feet could trigger a hypertensive crisis in such a patient. He used diagrams, charts, and a timeline that overlaid the canceled appointments with the tablet search history recovered from Eleanor's device. The searches appeared on screen, one by one. Undetected stroke triggers in elderly patients, high-altitude effects on chronic hypertension, Blue Ridge Parkway elevation points above 4,000 feet. Average emergency response time, rural Buncombe County. Each phrase glowed on the courtroom monitor like a countdown, and I watched the jury foreman's expression shift from attention to something harder. Something that looked like the moment you realize the ticking you've been hearing is not a clock. The defense cross-examined each witness with the aggressive precision of a team billing $400 an hour, but the documents held. Signatures don't lie when a forensic examiner has measured the pen pressure to the milligram. Digital timestamps don't waver when a certified lab has verified the server logs. And a notary who has already surrendered his license has no reason to protect the man who handed him envelopes of cash in a gallery office that now sat empty and padlocked on the south end of Asheville. By 4:17 in the afternoon, the prosecution had rested its first 3 phases. Tomorrow would bring phase 4. Eleanor's testimony, the recorded phone call, and the pocket watch. I looked across the courtroom at my son, who had not moved, had not reacted, had not once turned his head toward the woman he had tried to reduce to a line item on an insurance form. His stillness was mechanical, the frozen posture of a clock, whose mainspring has snapped, but whose hands remain fixed in position, displaying a time that no longer exists. I wondered if he understood yet that the courtroom was not a gallery, that evidence could not be curated, and that the jury was not an audience he could charm with champagne and lighting. Eleanor squeezed the pocket watch in her lap. I saw her knuckles whiten, hold for 3 seconds, then release. She was counting, practicing, preparing for tomorrow, when 90 seconds of truth would carry more weight than 14 months of lies. I reached across the armrest and placed my hand over hers. The watch ticked between our palms, steady and indifferent, keeping the only kind of time that matters, the kind that cannot be forged. Eleanor took the stand at 9:11 in the morning. I know the exact time because I glanced at my grandfather's pocket watch the moment the bailiff called her name, and the second hand was crossing the 12 with the quiet certainty of a mechanism that has never once needed to justify its accuracy. She rose from the wheelchair slowly, waving off the court officer who moved to assist her, and walked the 14 steps to the witness box using the oak cane Opal had found at an estate sale in Black Mountain. 14 steps. I counted each one the way I count the teeth on an escape wheel, because each tooth determines whether the next second arrives or doesn't. She placed her left hand on the Bible and her right on the rail. And when the clerk asked her to state her name, she spoke in a voice that carried no tremor, no hesitation, and no performance. Eleanor Marie Oakes. 3 words. The courtroom received them the way a tuning fork receives a strike, vibrating at a frequency that silenced every other sound in the room. Prosecutor Alderman approached the witness box with 4 documents in a clear plastic folder. She laid the first on the ledge in front of Eleanor. The forged durable power of attorney dated 14 months earlier. Mrs. Oakes. Do you recognize the signature on this document? Eleanor looked at it for 6 seconds. I watched her eyes trace the loops, the pressure points, the spacing between letters. She had signed her name tens of thousands of times in 67 years of living, and a woman who has written her own identity that many times knows its shape the way a river knows its banks. That is not my signature, she said. The capital E leans right. Mine leans left. It has for 50 years. The second document. The primary life insurance beneficiary change. That is not my signature. The crossbar on the T is too high. I cross low. I always have. The third document. The supplemental policy change. Not mine. The K in Oakes is closed at the top. I leave it open. My mother taught me to write that way when I was 7 years old. The fourth document, the HELOC authorization for $220,000 against our cabin at 14 Ridgecrest Lane. Eleanor held this one longer than the others, turning it slightly in the light, as if examining a photograph of a place she had loved and lost. This is not my signature. And this is not my home anymore. Because someone signed it away, using a version of my name that doesn't exist. 4 documents. 4 denials. Each delivered in under 15 seconds. Exactly as Miranda had coached, and each landing in the courtroom with the precise, irreversible weight of a clock hand advancing to the next minute. I looked at the jury. The foreman, a man in his early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, was writing something on his notepad with the kind of pressure that dents the page beneath. A woman in seat number 9 had stopped blinking. Alderman then asked Eleanor to describe her understanding of her medical care during the months in question. Eleanor explained that she had trusted Gavin to manage her health portal after a minor stroke 2 years earlier had made screen navigation difficult. She believed her appointments were being kept. She believed her cardiologist was monitoring her blood pressure. She believed her son was protecting her. I gave him the password to my health, she said, and he used it to take my health away. The defense attorney, a tall man named Prescott, with a silver tie pin shaped like a gavel, rose for cross-examination. He moved carefully, the way a person moves around machinery they suspect is still running. Mrs. Oakes, you've stated that you have no memory of the 8 months preceding your injury. Is that correct? That is correct. Then how can you be certain that you did not in fact authorize these documents during a period you cannot remember? Eleanor paused. Not from confusion, not from doubt, but from the kind of deliberate stillness I recognized from 40 years of watching her consider a question before answering it with something that could not be argued. Because I know what my hand does when it writes my name. Amnesia took my memory of events. It did not take my memory of myself. I have been signing Eleanor Oakes since 1975. No 8-month gap changes 50 years of muscle and ink. Prescott did not ask another question. He returned to the defense table and made a note. But his pen hovered above the page for 3 seconds before touching down. The hesitation of a man recalculating a position he had believed was strong. Alderman then requested permission to play the recorded phone call. Judge Hollowell approved. The court technician connected the audio system, and for 4 minutes and 31 seconds, The courtroom listened to my son's voice filling the space between the oak walls. Every word I had heard that night in my workshop now echoed in a room designed to weigh words on a scale that does not forgive. The champagne glasses clinking in the background. The rehearsed sobs at 60 beats per minute. The strategic calculation about Eleanor's amnesia. And the final whispered threat. You'll regret this. When this is over, you'll have nothing left. When the recording ended, the silence was so complete I could hear the pocket watch ticking in Eleanor's hand from 15 feet away. She had been holding it throughout the playback, gripping the silver case the way a person grips a railing at the edge of a long fall. Her knuckles were white. Her hand was steady. 90 seconds of grip strength built over 6 days of practice, and she had held it for 4 minutes and 31 seconds without a single tremor. Alderman turned to the jury. The prosecution would like to enter into evidence. One final item. A Waltham Model 1883 pocket watch, railroad grade, adjusted to 5 positions, belonging to the Oakes family for 3 generations. This watch was not sold, was not forged, was not manipulated, and was not stolen, because the man who owns it kept it in a place his son never found. She looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Oakes, can you tell the jury why you asked to hold this watch today? Eleanor lifted the pocket watch from her lap and held it in front of her. The silver case catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom and throwing a small bright circle onto the ceiling. Her voice when it came was not loud. It did not need to be, because this is what inheritance is supposed to feel like. It's supposed to tick. It's supposed to keep going. It's supposed to be passed from one hand to the next with love, not with a forged signature and a notary's stamp. My son was supposed to receive this watch one day. Instead, he sold everything else and tried to make sure I wouldn't be alive to give it to him. She closed the case with a soft click that the courtroom microphone carried to every corner of the room. I wanted the jury to hear that sound. A click, not a crash. That's how a family breaks. Quietly, one document at a time. I did not look at Gavin. I did not need to. The sound I heard from the defense table was enough. A single, sharp intake of breath, the mechanical gasp of a mainspring releasing its last stored tension before the movement goes still. Whether it was remorse or merely the recognition that the case was lost, I could not say. A watchmaker can diagnose a mechanism by its sound, but even the finest ear cannot distinguish between a spring that has broken and one that has simply run down. Judge Hollowell called a 45-minute recess. Eleanor returned to the wheelchair, placed the pocket watch in my hand, and said 5 words that I will carry longer than any timepiece I have ever wound. The cycle stops with us. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. I know this because I sat on the bench outside room 3, with the pocket watch open in my palm, tracking each minute the way I once tracked the drift of a marine chronometer during a 72-hour accuracy test. 3 hours and 47 minutes, 227 minutes, 13,620 seconds. Each one, a full oscillation of the balance wheel inside the Waltham, each one carrying the same question forward and forward and forward, until the bailiff opened the double doors and said the word that compressed every remaining second into a single held breath. Verdict. Eleanor sat beside me in the wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. The rubber exercise ball tucked into the side pocket of the chair, where she kept it at all times now. Opal stood behind us, one hand resting on Eleanor's shoulder, with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had already survived her own version of this courtroom, her own son, her own betrayal, her own rebuilding. Miranda Chen was already inside, standing at the prosecution table with Diane Alderman, both of them facing the jury box with the composed stillness of people who have done everything the evidence allows and now must trust 12 strangers to do the rest. I pushed Eleanor through the doors and positioned the wheelchair at the end of the front row, exactly where we had sat every day of the trial. Gavin was already at the defense table. He was wearing the same charcoal suit, but it no longer fit him the way it had on the first morning. The collar gaped slightly at the neck, and his shoulders had settled into a lower position, as though the architecture holding him upright had begun to give way from the inside. He still did not look at us. He looked at the table surface directly in front of his hands, which were clasped together with the interlocked rigidity of gears that have seized. Judge Hollowell entered at 1:53 in the afternoon and asked the jury foreman to rise. He was the man in his early 50s with the reading glasses, the one who had been writing on his notepad with enough pressure to dent the page beneath. He stood, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and began to read. Count 1. Elder financial abuse, through systematic theft of retirement assets, totaling $375,000. Guilty. Count 2. Forgery of legal instruments, including durable power of attorney, insurance beneficiary designations, and home equity authorization. Guilty. Count 3. Theft by swindle in excess of $100,000. Guilty. Count 4. Insurance fraud involving alteration of life insurance policies totaling $800,000. Guilty. Count 5. Medical fraud through deliberate cancellation of critical healthcare appointments resulting in bodily harm. Guilty. Count 6. Attempted manslaughter by gross negligence, predicated on premeditated research into medical vulnerabilities and deliberate placement of the victim in conditions designed to trigger a fatal event. Guilty. 6 counts, 6 verdicts. Each one spoken in the same measured cadence, like the striking of a clock tower marking an hour that the entire town must hear whether they wish to or not. The foreman's voice did not waver. The paper in his hand did not tremble. He read each count as though he were reading the time from a dial that had been set correctly and verified by every instrument available to the court. Gavin did not move. His attorney placed a hand on his forearm, but Gavin did not acknowledge it. He remained fixed in position, staring at the table, his clasped hands whitening at the knuckles. I have dismantled thousands of timepieces in my career, and I have learned that the most dangerous moment in any mechanism's life is not when it breaks. It is the moment just after, when all the stored energy has been released and the parts sit motionless in their housing, no longer connected to any purpose. That was my son at 1:57 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in late October. A mechanism emptied of function, housing intact, movement still. Judge Hollowell scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. When that morning arrived, the courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial. The spectators who had come for the drama had moved on. What remained were the people for whom this was not a story, but a life. Eleanor and I sat in the same positions. Opal sat behind us. Miranda and Alderman stood at their respective tables, and Gavin stood when the judge asked him to. Rising from the defense chair with the slow, unbalanced motion of a pendulum that has lost its regulation weight, Judge Hollowell addressed him directly. She spoke for 7 minutes about the nature of the crimes, the breach of familial trust, the calculated exploitation of elderly parents, the deliberate endangerment of a vulnerable person's medical care, and the sustained pattern of deception that had unfolded over 14 months with what she described as meticulous premeditation indistinguishable from malice. She noted the cooperation of Daniel Fisk, the strength of the forensic evidence, the testimony of Eleanor Oakes, and the recorded phone call in which the defendant had demonstrated, in the court's judgment, a continuing absence of genuine remorse. She then imposed the sentence. Count 1, 8 years. Count 2, 6 years. Count 3, 5 years. Count 4, 7 years. Count 5, 4 years. Count 6, 8 years. Counts 1 through 4 to run concurrently. Counts 5 and 6 to run consecutively to the concurrent block. Total custodial sentence: 38 years in the North Carolina Division of Adult Correction. 38 years. The number landed in my chest like the final strike of a repeater complication, the kind of chime that sounds once and then leaves the room in a silence so dense it feels architectural. 38. The same number as the phone calls I had logged in my notebook. The same number as the years between my father's crime and my son's arrest. I did not choose this symmetry. It chose itself. The way certain frequencies in a mechanism align without the watchmaker's intention, producing a resonance that cannot be engineered and cannot be ignored. Gavin was escorted from the courtroom through a side door. He paused at the threshold, and for the first time since the trial began, he turned his head and looked at Eleanor. Not at me. At her. His expression carried something I could not classify with any tool in my professional vocabulary. It was not remorse. It was not anger. It was not the performed grief of the jailhouse phone call. It was the look of a man seeing something he had already discounted, already liquidated, already removed from his inventory, and discovering that it still existed, that it was still breathing, that it was holding a pocket watch he had failed to find. Eleanor met his gaze. She did not speak. She did not nod. She held the Waltham in her left hand, the hand that had trembled for months and now gripped the silver case with the earned strength of a woman who had practiced for this moment without knowing this was the moment she was practicing for. She held his gaze for 4 seconds, no more. And then she looked down at the watch in her palm and opened the case. The dial read 1:53, the same time the verdict had been announced 3 weeks earlier. I had wound it that morning. 3 clicks, as I had every morning for 40 years. It kept its own time, indifferent to verdicts and sentences and the sound of a side door closing behind a man who had once been a boy in my workshop, learning to hold a loop steady. The door closed. The courtroom exhaled. And Eleanor said, without looking up from the watch, "Take me home, Raymond." We drove home in silence, the kind of silence that follows a detonation, not empty but dense, with particles still settling. Opal followed in her station wagon, and when we pulled into the gravel driveway at 14 Ridgecrest Lane, the cabin looked exactly as it had that morning. White clapboard, green shutters, the workshop addition jutting off the east side like a thought the house had never finished expressing. But I saw it differently now. Every board and beam had been leveraged against us, appraised and mortgaged, and scheduled for auction by a son who had stood in this driveway at 2:51 in the morning, loading boxes into a black Range Rover. The house had survived. Whether it still felt like home was a question I could not yet answer. I began the purge the following Saturday, 7 days after the verdict. Eleanor insisted on supervising from a chair I positioned in the hallway between the living room and Gavin's old bedroom, so she could see both spaces without moving. Her cane leaned against the wall beside her, and the pocket watch sat open on her knee, ticking its indifferent rhythm while I dismantled 29 years of a son's presence from the architecture of our lives. His bedroom had remained largely unchanged since he left for college, a preservation I had once considered sentimental and now recognized as negligent. The shelves held trophies from a high school debate team, framed photographs of family trips to the Outer Banks, a collection of art books he had accumulated during his first gallery internship. I removed each item with the deliberate care of a man disassembling a contaminated movement, handling every component, not with hatred, but with the clinical awareness that something toxic had been housed inside. Something beautiful for longer than I had been willing to admit. Opal arrived at noon with cardboard boxes and packing tape. She worked beside me without commentary, wrapping frames in newspaper and labeling boxes with a black marker in her precise accountant's hand. When I hesitated over a photograph of Gavin at age 9, standing in my workshop with a loop pressed to his eye and a grin so wide it seemed to contain every possible future, Opal took it gently from my hands and placed it face down in the box. "You're not erasing him," she said. "You're filing him. There's a difference. An accountant never destroys a ledger. She closes it and opens a new one." By Sunday evening, 17 boxes sat stacked in the garage, each one sealed and labeled with contents and dates. I did not throw them away. I could not. A watchmaker does not discard broken parts. He catalogs them, stores them in labeled drawers, and acknowledges that they once belonged to a mechanism that functioned. The boxes would remain in the garage until I understood what to do with them. and I granted myself the patience to not understand yet. The financial rebuilding began on Monday, when Miranda Chen filed a civil recovery claim against Oaks Contemporary LLC and its remaining assets. The gallery had been padlocked since the bankruptcy filing, but Detective Ruiz's forensic audit had identified recoverable funds: $14,000 in a secondary operating account that Gavin had overlooked, $41,000 from the forced sale of gallery inventory, mostly contemporary prints and installation pieces that a liquidation firm in Charlotte valued and sold within 3 weeks. The Manhattan consignment house that had handled the stolen watches cooperated after receiving a subpoena, returning $67,000 in proceeds from sales that had not yet been disbursed to Gavin's account. Opal traced an additional $23,000 through a payment platform linked to the fraudulent NFT transactions, frozen by federal order after the IRS opened its own parallel investigation. In total, we recovered $145,000 of the $700,000 that had been taken. Miranda estimated that the HELOC could be contested and potentially reversed, given the forged authorization. But the legal process would take 18 to 24 months. The retirement fund was gone. $375,000 dissolved into wire transfers, NFT speculation, gallery rent, and a lifestyle my son had built on the back of 2 people who had trusted him with the keys to everything they owned. I sat in my workshop that evening and performed an accounting of my own. The cabin, if the HELOC reversal succeeded, would be ours again. The recovered funds would cover Eleanor's remaining medical bills and 12 months of living expenses if we maintained the careful budget Opal had drafted. The workshop itself, with its inventory of tools, reference materials, and the 18 counterfeit watches that would eventually be returned as evidence after the appeals period, still represented a functioning trade. I was 67 years old. My hands were steady. My eyes, with the aid of the loupes I had used for 4 decades, could still distinguish a genuine movement from a forgery at arm's length. I could work, not at the pace I once maintained, but with the precision that had never left me. Eleanor began physical therapy 3 times a week at a clinic in Black Mountain. By the end of November, she was walking without the cane for short distances, her left hand's tremor reduced to a faint vibration, visible only when she was tired. She started cooking again on the first Tuesday of December, a pot of chicken soup that filled the cabin with a smell so familiar it felt like a hand reaching back through time to steady me. We ate at the kitchen table with the pocket watch between us, a habit neither of us had discussed or agreed upon, but that had simply established itself, the way rituals do when they arise from necessity rather than design. Opal visited every Thursday evening, bringing financial updates and a bottle of wine she claimed was medicinal. She had begun volunteering at the Buncombe County Elder Services Office, reviewing financial documents for seniors who suspected exploitation by family members. "Your case is not unique," she told me one evening, pouring a second glass with the steady hand of a woman who measured everything. "I've seen 4 cases this month alone. Sons, daughters, grandchildren. The pattern is identical. Access, isolation, documentation, liquidation. The only variable is whether someone catches it before the account hits 0. I thought about my father, Harold Oaks, who had forged his parents' signatures and stolen $90,000 and gone to prison for 4 years and written 7 letters I had hidden in a rusted tin box in the attic. I had broken the cycle by exposing it, but breaking a cycle does not repair the damage already done. It only prevents the next rotation. The gears that were stripped remain stripped. The teeth that were sheared do not grow back. What you can do, what I was learning to do, is build a new mechanism around the damage, one that acknowledges the missing teeth and compensates for them with a different configuration, a different ratio, a different way of keeping time. On the 3rd Saturday of December, I reopened the workshop for business. I placed a small handwritten sign in the window that read, "Oaks Horology, Repairs and Restorations, by appointment." The first customer arrived the following Monday. A woman in her 70s carrying a mantel clock her late husband had purchased in 1968. The mainspring was broken. The dial was cracked. The case had water damage along the left side where a pipe had burst in her basement 2 winters ago. "Can you fix it?" she asked. I opened the case back, examined the movement under the loupe, and assessed the damage with the honest eye of a man who had recently learned the cost of looking away. "I can't restore it to what it was," I said, "but I can make it run again." She nodded. "That's enough." It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. New Year's Eve arrived the way all significant dates arrive in a watchmaker's life. Not with the dramatic urgency the calendar implies, but with the slow, inevitable precision of hands completing their circuit. December 31st. 365 days reduced to their final hours, and I found myself in the workshop at 4 in the afternoon, cleaning a 1909 Hamilton Railroad watch for a retired conductor in Hendersonville who wanted it running by midnight. He had carried it for 41 years on the Southern Railway line and told me on the phone that a year should not end without the sound of a proper movement marking its last seconds. I understood him completely. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing a meal she had planned for 3 days, roasted chicken with rosemary from the small herb garden she had started on the south-facing windowsill in November. The garden was her idea, and she tended it with the focused attention of a woman relearning what it means to nurture something that grows on its own schedule rather than on the schedule someone else imposes. Her left hand still trembled when she was fatigued, a faint oscillation I noticed most in the evenings, but she no longer mentioned it. She had integrated the tremor into her movements the way a skilled horologist integrates a known imperfection into a restoration. Acknowledging it, compensating for it, and refusing to let it define the function of the whole. Opal arrived at 6 with a bottle of champagne and a document. The document was a printed confirmation from the Buncombe County Register of Deeds showing that Miranda Chen's petition to void the fraudulent HELOC had been granted preliminary approval. The full reversal would take another 12 months, but the lien on 14 Ridgecrest Lane had been suspended pending resolution. Our cabin, for the first time in 14 months, was no longer collateral for a debt we had never authorized. Opal set the paper on the kitchen table beside the pocket watch and said nothing. She did not need to. Numbers, properly arranged, speak for themselves. We ate dinner at 7:15. 3 place settings. 3 glasses of champagne poured with Opal's measured hand, each one filled to precisely the same level, because some habits of precision cannot be unlearned, and should not be. Eleanor raised her glass and offered a toast that contained no reference to the trial, no mention of Gavin's name, and no acknowledgement of the $700,000 that had been taken, or the $145,000 that had been recovered. She said, "To the things that still tick." We drank. The champagne was cold and sharp and entirely adequate. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the workshop. I had prepared something over the preceding 2 weeks, working in the early mornings before Eleanor woke, using skills I had accumulated over 4 decades of handling small, intricate, and deeply personal objects. 6 pocket watches, not antiques, not forgeries, not replicas. 6 simple, functional, hand-wound movements housed in brushed steel cases I had sourced from a supply company in Providence, Rhode Island. Each case was engraved on the back with a single word. The first read, "Steady." The second, "Patient." The third, "Honest." The fourth, "Present." The fifth, "Enough." The sixth, "Home." I had built them not as merchandise or gifts in the conventional sense, but as markers, anchors. 6 words that described what I wanted the remaining years to contain, each one housed in a mechanism that required daily attention to continue functioning. You had to wind them. You had to listen to them. You had to hold them in your hand and feel the resistance of the mainspring accepting your effort and converting it into motion. They were, in every sense I could engineer, the opposite of what my son had done. He had taken things that ran on trust and let them wind down. These watches ran on intention. 3 clicks each morning, and they would keep time for 40 hours. I placed the 6 watches in a wooden box I had built from reclaimed oak, sanded and oiled until the grain shone with the deep amber warmth of something that had been broken and repurposed into something that could hold weight again. The box had no lock. I was finished with locked things. Sealed drawers and hidden compartments and buried letters had protected nothing. They had only delayed the moment when the damage became visible. This box would sit open on the mantel, its contents accessible to anyone who entered our home, because the truths inside it were not secrets. They were declarations. I carried the box into the living room at 11:41, 19 minutes before midnight. Eleanor was sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace, the pocket watch open in her lap, the fire casting amber light across the silver case. Opal was on the sofa with her second glass of champagne and a paperback novel she was pretending to read. I set the box on the mantel and opened it, so the 6 watches were visible, each one ticking at its own rate, their combined sound creating a gentle, layered rhythm that filled the room like a conversation between 6 voices saying the same thing in slightly different cadences. Eleanor looked at the watches, then at me. She did not ask what they were for. She reached into the box and picked up the one engraved. Enough. Held it to her ear and closed her eyes. The fire crackled. Opal set down her book. The room held its breath in the way rooms do when something is being understood rather than explained. At 11:58, I turned on the radio to the local station broadcasting the countdown from Pack Square in downtown Asheville. The announcer's voice was cheerful and distant, a sound from a world that measured time in confetti and resolutions and the collective shout of strangers. I listened to it the way I listen to all mechanical noise, with respect for its function and awareness of its limitations. A countdown tells you when a moment arrives. It does not tell you what the moment contains. That is the work of the people standing inside it. At midnight, Eleanor opened her eyes, set the watch back in the box, and took my hand. Her grip was firm. Her tremor was quiet. The 6 watches ticked on the mantel, and my grandfather's Waltham ticked in her lap, and somewhere in the walls of the cabin the old pipes carried the faint vibration of water moving through copper, which is its own kind of clockwork, its own kind of persistence. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked at the box on the mantel, 6 steel cases catching the firelight. 6 words I had chosen not because they were grand, but because they were true. Steady, patient, honest, present, enough, home. I thought about the woman in her 70s who had brought me the broken mantel clock and asked if I could fix it. I thought about my answer. I thought about how the truest things I have ever said in my life were said not to juries or judges or sons who had stopped listening, but to the person sitting across from me at a workbench, waiting to know if something damaged could still keep time. "We wind the watches," I said. And we start again. The fire burned low. The 6 movements ticked in their open box, and outside, in the cold mountain dark of a new year, the cabin on Ridgecrest Lane held its ground the way it always had. Not because it was unbreakable, but because someone had decided it was worth repairing. 3 clicks. 40 hours. More than enough to begin.